There exists a pain so intimate, so consuming, that we dare not speak its name. It is not guilt, that sharp sting which tells us we have done something wrong. No, this is deeper, more corrosive. It whispers that we ourselves are wrong, that something at our core is fundamentally defective, unworthy of love, irredeemable. The ancient Greeks had no word for it. The Romans spoke of it rarely, yet every human being knows its taste. The bitter poison of shame. Shame is the shadow that follows us from childhood, the invisible hand that shapes how we move through the world. It is there in the downcast eyes, the slumped shoulders, the desperate need to hide. While guilt says, "I made a mistake," shame declares, "I am a mistake." One can be corrected, the other feels permanent, woven into the fabric of our being. In our modern age, we have pathologized nearly everything: anxiety, depression, trauma, yet shame remains largely unspoken, festering in the darkness of our psyche. We carry it like a secret curse, convinced that if others truly saw us, they would turn away in disgust. This is shame's greatest trick. It isolates us completely, making each of us believe we are uniquely broken, alone in our defectiveness. Carl Jung wrote that shame is a soul-eating emotion. It does not merely wound us, it devours us from within, consuming our sense of worth, our capacity for connection, our very will to exist. Those who have never felt its full weight cannot comprehend its power. Those who have carried it, like Atlas, carry the world, an invisible burden that grows heavier with each passing year. Why do we feel broken inside? Because shame has convinced us that we are. But this ancient wound, this primal fear of being seen and rejected, is not the end of our story. It is, paradoxically, the very threshold through which we must pass to become whole. The etymology of shame reveals its original meaning: to cover, to hide oneself. In nearly every language, the word carries connotations of exposure and concealment. The German Scham, the Sanskrit Lajja, the Hebrew Bosheth all speak to the same fundamental experience: the unbearable feeling of being seen in our nakedness, our vulnerability, our perceived worthlessness. Shame is the affect of unwanted exposure, the psychic equivalent of standing naked before a jeering crowd with nowhere to hide. This is why the first story of shame appears in Genesis, immediately following the act that brought consciousness itself into being. When Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, their eyes were opened and they saw that they were naked. Prior to this moment, nakedness caused no distress. But with the dawning of self-consciousness came shame, and their immediate response was to cover themselves with fig leaves and hide from God. We have misunderstood this story for millennia, reading it as a tale of disobedience and punishment. In truth, it describes the psychological birth of the human being. The serpent promised that eating the fruit would make them as gods, knowing good and evil. What it delivered was something far more terrible: the capacity to see oneself as an object, to judge oneself as either acceptable or unacceptable, worthy or worthless. The tree of knowledge granted not omniscience, but self-consciousness, and with it came shame, the price we pay for being human. Notice that God's first question is not an accusation, but an inquiry. Where are you? Adam's response reveals everything. I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, so I hid. Fear and shame, exposure and concealment, the fundamental dynamic that would plague humanity forever after. We are still hiding, still afraid of being truly seen. Psychologically, shame develops early, long before we have words to name it. The infant who reaches for the mother and finds her face turned away, the child who expresses natural enthusiasm and meets disapproval, the young person whose authentic self is met with disgust or rejection. These moments imprint themselves upon the psyche, creating what Jung called complexes, autonomous fragments of the personality that carry their own emotional charge. Shame is perhaps the most toxic of all complexes because it attacks the very foundation of selfhood. Where other emotions come and go, shame becomes identity. It transforms from "I feel ashamed" to "I am shameful." This internalization is shame's dark alchemy. It transmutes a temporary state into a permanent condition of being. Donald Nathanson, in his work on affect theory, describes shame as existing on a spectrum he calls the compass of shame. At one pole lies withdrawal, the impulse to disappear, to make oneself small, to avoid all contact. Here we find those who live in perpetual hiding, terrified of being discovered. At another pole lies attack self, the internal persecution, the savage self-criticism, the belief that one deserves punishment. Then comes avoidance, the desperate attempt to distract oneself through addiction, work, pleasure-seeking, anything to escape the gnawing sense of defectiveness. Finally, there is attack other shame, converted into rage, the projection of one's internal worthlessness onto the external world. Most of us employ all four strategies at different times, shifting between them like refugees fleeing an advancing army. But the army is within us, and there is nowhere to run. In his novel Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky gives us Raskolnikov, a man so consumed by shame that he commits murder, attempting to prove he is beyond ordinary morality, that he belongs to the extraordinary class of men who can transgress without consequence. Yet the moment he kills, his shame intensifies 1,000-fold. He becomes feverish, paranoid, unable to bear the presence of others. The detective Porfiry knows his guilt not through evidence, but through the visible weight of shame that hangs upon him like a shroud. Raskolnikov confesses not because he is caught, but because the burden of hiding becomes more unbearable than the punishment he will receive. This is shame's terrible paradox. We hide to protect ourselves, yet hiding only deepens the wound. The very act of concealment confirms our belief that we are too shameful to be seen. Sonia, the prostitute who loves Raskolnikov, embodies the opposite response to shame. She too lives in degradation, selling her body to support her family. Yet, she does not hide. When Raskolnikov asks how she can live with such shame, she responds simply, "What else can I do?" She has accepted her condition without letting it define her essence. She knows she is more than what she does, more than how others see her. This distinction is crucial. Shame tries to convince us that we are nothing more than our worst moments, our greatest failures, our most degrading experiences. It collapses the entirety of our being into a single point of defectiveness. To heal shame, we must learn what Sonia knows: that our worth is not contingent upon external validation, that we contain multitudes, that no single aspect of ourselves can define the whole. Jung observed that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Rather than face the genuine pain of our wounds, we create elaborate defenses, symptoms, and stories that allow us to avoid the central confrontation. Shame operates precisely this way. It offers us a simple, terrible narrative. You are fundamentally broken. This narrative, painful as it is easier to accept than the more complex truth that we are wounded, yes, but not broken, flawed, but not worthless, limited, but not beyond redemption. The psychoanalyst Helen Block Lewis distinguished between what she termed overt shame and bypassed shame. Overt shame is the acute, painful awareness of exposure, the burning face, the desire to sink into the floor, the moment when we know we have been seen in our inadequacy. Bypassed shame, however, operates beneath conscious awareness. It manifests as chronic self-consciousness, as a vague sense of defectiveness that colors everything we do, as an inexplicable conviction that we do not belong. Most people suffering from bypassed shame have no idea that shame is their primary affliction. They speak of depression, anxiety, emptiness, but cannot name the core wound. They feel perpetually on the outside looking in, convinced that others possess some essential quality they lack. This is shame's invisibility cloak. It hides even from the one who carries it. In Greek mythology, we find shame personified in Eidos, the goddess of modesty, reverence, and respect. But Eidos has a darker sister, Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, who punishes hubris. Together, they represent the double bind of shame. If we reveal ourselves too fully, we risk Nemesis the punishment of exposure, rejection, humiliation. If we hide ourselves completely, we lose Eidos the capacity for genuine connection, for being known and loved as we truly are. The myth of Narcissus illuminates this bind from another angle. We typically understand Narcissus as a symbol of self-love, but the deeper truth is that he represents the tragedy of shame. Narcissus cannot love the nymph Echo because he cannot truly see another person. His vision is turned entirely inward, trapped in the prison of self-consciousness. When he sees his reflection in the pool and falls in love with it, he is not celebrating himself but trying desperately to bridge the gap between his inner experience and external validation. He starves beside the water, unable to embrace the image that tantalizes him, dying of a thirst that can never be quenched. This is precisely the condition of the shame-bound individual, forever seeking external confirmation of worth while simultaneously convinced that such confirmation, if given, must be based on a false image. The real self remains hidden, unlovable. Only the mask can be loved, and love given to a mask is no love at all. Gershon Kaufman writes that shame is the affect of inferiority. It is the feeling of being fundamentally less than others, of occupying a lower rank in the invisible hierarchy of human worth. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that shame evolved as a mechanism to prevent social exclusion. In our ancestral environment, banishment from the tribe meant death. Shame, then, was an internal signal that we had violated social norms and risked expulsion. It motivated conformity, submission, the desperate attempt to regain acceptance. But in the modern psyche, this ancient alarm system has gone haywire. We experience shame not only for genuine transgressions, but for aspects of ourselves we cannot control. Our appearance, our background, our desires, our very existence. The internalized voice of the shaming other, whether parent, peer, or culture, becomes a tyrant that persecutes us without mercy. In the Buddhist tradition, there is a concept called hiri, often translated as moral shame or conscience. This is distinguished from ottappa, which means fear of wrongdoing. Hiri is considered wholesome, a natural sensitivity to the ethical dimensions of our actions. It prevents us from causing harm and motivates us toward virtue. But Buddhism also recognizes kukucha, unwholesome remorse or toxic shame that paralyzes rather than liberates. The distinction is vital. Healthy shame, if we can call it that, alerts us when we have violated our own values. It creates the discomfort necessary for moral development. Toxic shame, however, tells us that we are inherently bad, that our very existence is a violation. One leads to growth, the other to despair. Brené Brown, in her research on shame and vulnerability, discovered that shame needs three things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. It thrives in darkness, in the unspoken, in the harsh inner courtroom where we convict ourselves repeatedly. The antidote, she found, is not positive thinking or self-esteem affirmations, but empathy, the experience of having our shame witnessed by another person who responds not with disgust, but with compassion. This is why confession has been a central ritual in so many religious traditions, not because God needs to hear our sins, but because we need to speak our shame in the presence of another and discover that we are not destroyed by the revelation. The Catholic confessional, the Jewish Yom Kippur, the Buddhist practice of acknowledging transgressions before the Sangha all serve the same psychological function. They break shame's spell of isolation. Jung understood this deeply. He wrote that the consulting room was the modern equivalent of the confessional, and that the therapeutic relationship worked not through technique, but through the genuine encounter between two human souls. When the analyst could meet the patient's shame without recoil, without judgment, something transformative occurred. The patient discovered that their worst self could be witnessed, and they would not be abandoned. But what of those who carry not the shame of something they have done, but the shame of what has been done to them? The child who was abused carries a shame that is not theirs by right, yet feels as real as any transgression they might have committed. This is shame's cruelest trick. It migrates from perpetrator to victim, from the guilty to the innocent. Alice Miller, in her work on childhood trauma, observed that children naturally blame themselves for abuse because the alternative, accepting that their caregivers are dangerous, is psychologically unbearable. Better to believe, I am bad and they are good, than to face the terror of being dependent upon someone malevolent or indifferent. Thus, shame becomes a defense mechanism, a way of maintaining the illusion of control in a situation where we are utterly powerless. The path through shame is not around it but through it. This is the teaching of every wisdom tradition, though each expresses it differently. The alchemist spoke of the nigredo, the blackening, the descent into putrefaction, where base matter is dissolved before it can be transformed into gold. The Christian mystic spoke of the dark night of the soul, where God seems absent and the self is stripped of all consolations. The shamanic traditions speak of dismemberment, the tearing apart of the old self before rebirth becomes possible. Shame is our personal nigredo, our dark night, our dismemberment. To heal it, we must first be willing to feel it fully, to stop running from the unbearable sensation of our own supposed worthlessness. This sounds masochistic, but it is precisely the opposite. Running from shame gives it power. Turning toward it begins to dissolve its grip. Franz Kafka, who lived his entire life under the tyranny of shame, wrote in his diary, "You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world. That is something you are free to do, and it accords with your nature, but perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering you could avoid." We hold ourselves back from life because we are ashamed, and this holding back becomes its own form of suffering, perhaps worse than any rejection we might actually face. The Japanese art form of kintsugi offers a powerful metaphor for healing shame. When a ceramic bowl breaks, rather than discarding it or trying to hide the cracks, the artisan repairs it with lacquer mixed with gold. The breakage becomes part of the bowl's beauty, its history honored rather than concealed. The repaired bowl is considered more valuable than it was before it broke. This is what integration of shame looks like. Not the erasure of our wounds, not the pretense that we are unblemished, but the acknowledgement that our cracks are where the light enters, as Leonard Cohen wrote. Our shame, fully faced and integrated, becomes the very source of our compassion, our depth, our capacity to meet others in their own darkness without flinching. Jung stated that the gold is in the shadow, that what we most despise in ourselves contains our greatest potential. The parts of ourselves we have hidden away in shame, our vulnerability, our needs, our desires, our failures, are not contaminants to be purged but exiled aspects of our wholeness waiting to be reclaimed. In the film of our lives, we have cast ourselves as the villain, convinced the audience will boo when we appear. Shame is the internalized boo, playing on endless repeat. But what if we stopped writing ourselves as the antagonist? What if we recognized that we are not characters in someone else's story, but the authors of our own? Viktor Frankl, surviving the shame and degradation of the concentration camps, discovered that the last human freedom is the freedom to choose one's attitude in any circumstance. Even in absolute dehumanization, he found that meaning could be created through how one bore suffering. Those who maintained their inner dignity, who helped others despite having nothing, who found purpose even in hell, these were the ones who survived not just physically but spiritually. We cannot always choose our circumstances, and we certainly cannot choose the shame that was imposed upon us, but we can choose how we carry it. We can let it crush us into permanent hiding, or we can bring it into the light, examine it with clear eyes, and recognize it for what it is: a wound, not a truth, a story, not a sentence, a beginning, not an end. The psyche seeks wholeness with the same urgency that the body seeks healing. Every symptom, every defense, every neurotic pattern is the psyche's attempt to restore itself to balance. Shame, then, is not our enemy but a messenger, however painful its message. It tells us where we have lost connection with ourselves, where we have accepted false judgments as truth, where we have hidden parts of ourselves that long to be known. To feel broken inside is to stand at the threshold. Behind us lies the fragmentary self, the shamed self, the hidden self. Before us lies the possibility of wholeness. The crossing requires only one thing: the courage to be seen,